Okay, thank you so much for that. This is the third and final talk of a three-part talk about generating compassion through body awareness. And just to recap, the first talk was basically about the how Zen really emphasizes that the body and mind are not two separate things. We looked at case 54 of the Shoyo Roku, which talks about eyes throughout the body. And we looked at Dogen Zenji's Shinjin Gakudo, body and mind study of the way. And we saw how Dogen interweaves body and mind seamlessly. There's no real strong separation between those two things. And the second talk, we looked at how in the West, generally, there's this very clear separation between body and mind, and that this is often a place where people get stuck. They get stuck physically, mentally. Illnesses arise as a result of this body-mind separation. And at the close of the last talk, I mentioned that we tend to look at we focused in the second talk specifically on mental health issues. And I mentioned towards the end of that talk that anxiety, depression, addiction issues, bipolar, these things often are a surface level issues, and that underlying these issues is something much deeper. And that's what I want to talk about now in this third talk. One of the predominant, I'm not saying for all mental health issues, but one of the predominant issues in our society that underlies a lot of mental health issues is trauma, some form of early childhood trauma. So I'd like to talk about what does that look like for us, and how might Zen practice be of help to somebody that is suffering with trauma, whether they're aware of their trauma or not. How might Zen practice be of help? Because if we're really serious about being bodhisattvas, which I think we are, then we want to be able to help as many people as possible. And but we need to be educated as to how does our specific practice help. And to be clear, not all Zen centers are aware of how Zen might be effective for treating trauma. So I want to bring that element in here. But let's start out by getting a sense of what do we mean by trauma. Well, this is a somewhat extreme case that I'm going to share with you. So please, if you don't have the ears for this to hear it, you may want to just kind of close your ears for a moment. But this is one of the more extreme cases of trauma. I've been in dialogue with a man in prison, and this man shared with me, he says, as a child, I was physically, mentally, and emotionally abused. I had a cokehead for a mother who I watched every day get beat by my drunken father. I mean, that tells you a lot right there. So you can see a direct connection between the prison sentence and the early childhood. Has this person gotten this kind of early childhood trauma addressed? Well, he's seeing that Buddhism offers him something with regards to this. He says further, I suffered from abandonment, substance abuse, and the only way I could forget about my pain was in the streets. However, as a teen, I fought a lot, and if I lost, my father would beat me. I mean, so, I mean that tells me all I need to know, right? If somebody comes from that kind of a background, I know there's right that all of the pieces fit together for why a person is the way they are. And so if we look in our prison system, we can see a lot of people that have had traumatizing backgrounds as children. So how might Zen be an effective practice for such a population? I want to, you got folks, some of you there have been working in the prison system, and I applaud that. I think it's such good work. It's good practice. And we need to keep offering this practice because it's so powerful. So let's investigate together a little bit about how this connection with generating compassion. So the first question is like, well, this illustration I gave you gives a sense of what PTSD is, or post-traumatic stress disorder, how it might manifest, right? Because not everybody that has this, I should say, not everybody that has had a profoundly negative childhood experience is going to exhibit PTSD or trauma symptoms. So, many might, but not everybody. So that's just one thing to keep in the back of our mind, that there is, some people are very resilient and they can get on with their life regardless of what happened to them as children, but many can't. And this is a thing where there's a huge gap in our education around trauma, just in the general population. That's why I feel it's important to begin these kind of educational things on, like, what is trauma? How do we define it? If anybody would have anybody have a sense if they could define what trauma is? If you could give a definition, what would it be?
Something so extreme that it's hard to process.
Okay, yeah, something so extreme, hard to process. Yeah. And here's again, what is extreme for one person may not be extreme for another person. So we can't always go by what we assume to be extreme, right? So there are traumas that might not be as extreme as the one that I just shared with you. There may be traumas that are much milder. Yet, depending on the person who receives it, if they're very sensitive to even smaller traumas, it might result in a kind of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So that, in other words, even when the trauma has ended, there is still something lingering in the conscious of that person, or the consciousness of the person, well afterwards. And let's also distinguish here between kinds of trauma in terms of duration. So there's generally two kinds of trauma. One is acute, something that happens once and for all, like it could be a car accident. It could be some kind of natural disaster, or something that happens just one time, versus something that happens for a prolonged period of time during one's childhood. So there's a difference between these two kinds of trauma. One being a one-time event versus something that happens in one's childhood and one experiences for a duration. Say it could go on for months or years. And whereas the letter I just shared is something that obviously would be something that would go in the category of early childhood and prolonged. So you can imagine there that with those two kinds of traumas, there's probably going to be a more extreme response to something that is longer term in early childhood than there would be to a specific instance. And part of this has to do with the way that the psychology of the person develops. That a child who grows up in a relatively speaking safe environment is going to see the world as safe around them. Whereas a child who grows up in an environment where they don't feel safe is going to perceive the world as a dangerous place to be in. And it may be very hard to develop trust in other people because of that was the environment you were molded in, where you didn't trust people. To trust people was to put your life in danger. So let's look at one definition. This is from Bessel van der Kolk, a trauma expert here. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a national bestseller book. And if you want to learn more about how trauma affects us and affects our society, he's the expert. He's the one to check out. But he says, the goal of treatment of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is to help people live in the present without feeling or behaving according to irrelevant demands belonging to the past. To help people live in the present without feeling or behaving according to the irrelevant demands belonging to the past. So in other words, when somebody has PTSD, what they're exhibiting is that they're responding to the past. They're living in the present, but it's as though the past is still right there inside their head, and they can't get it out. And so even though the present moment has shifted, has changed, they're no longer in this unsafe environment, yet their mind perceives it as otherwise. And so they're reacting to a past event or events. These past events color their perception. But the body doesn't forget. The mind might forget. See, when somebody gets older, they might forget. They might not make any connection. And this is what I'm astounded by over and over and over again when I go to the hospital to facilitate what's called trauma-sensitive yoga classes. When I go to the hospitals, I remember I talk with people often, and some of them are very aware that they have PTSD resulting from past trauma. But a good number of people that I have had discussions with, I've come to realize that they've made no connection at all between their past, the trauma of their past, and their present situation. Oftentimes some kind of addictive or self-destructive behaviors. They make no connection there. It's almost as though they've, what we call, spiritually bypassed it. They've jumped over it. They think, okay, that was then. but they don't see the connection between that, and this is on an inpatient behavioral health ward. They don't see the connection between their past and how they got to be in a behavioral health ward. And I think it would be super helpful. Here they are in a hospital that they begin to recognize this connection. But it's not surprising because many of us in the mainstream society don't recognize this connection. They don't recognize this connection between somebody's early childhood and how they are today. And for the survivor of trauma, it's really also very difficult to recognize because oftentimes, if it's a really traumatic event or events, then the way that trauma is stored in moves. Traumatic memory is different from ordinary memory. It's stored differently in the brain. It bypasses certain things, the hippocampus, that has to do with memory. It bypasses these things, and so that and it enables somebody when they're in the midst of trauma to not think about it for the sake of surviving that particular trauma. If you're constantly dwelling on what's happening to you in the present moment, you're not going to survive it. So the brain and the human organism has developed a evolutionary capacity to learn to forget about the trauma in order to survive. And that's fine for when you're within a traumatic situation, but when you're out of it, it no longer serves the person, especially if they are then having PTSD. Then it may help. I mean, and here's the thing: is that we don't have to have a psychological analysis, or we don't have to have a cognitive therapeutic session or sessions in order to help somebody out. I mean, these things may be helpful for some people, but for a good number of trauma survivors, cognitive-based approaches, cognitive therapy, where you're working with thoughts and memory, many times don't work, because you have to access memory that may not be there or may be fragmented memories. There's something very alluring about this story in the Shoyo Roku, case 54, with regards to the body and the mind. How do you understand? Dao says, Yunyan says, all over the body is hands and eyes. All over the body is hands and eyes. When the mind or the brain, we kind of use those two things together. When the mind forgets something, the body keeps the score. Eyes throughout the body. It's the whole body. It's the whole body. The body doesn't forget. The body doesn't forget what has happened. It stores everything in it. It stores all. In Zen and in Buddhism, we talk about alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. Our whole being does not forget what's happened. But on the surface level, the mind consciousness may have forgotten a particular event or events in the past that were traumatic. But the whole body has a working memory, even if we, on the conscious level, on the mind conscious level of awareness, has forgotten about it. The body keeps it, holds it, stores it. The eyes see it, right? In a sense, the eyes throughout the body see it. So that's why I don't know if you're making this connection with me, but this is why I love this particular koan case. It's very real to me. And Bessel van der Kolk says, trauma victims cannot recover until they become familiar with and befriend the sensations in their bodies. Physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. Physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. So you can see how Zen practice, being such a physically oriented practice, might have some benefit here. And I want to suggest that actually there are, well, before I do that, I do want to suggest three ways in which Zen practice can be helpful. But the example I gave you of trauma is quite extreme. I don't want to leave you with that as your only illustration of it. So I'm going to read to you from a book called Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga, where they say here, according to a national incidence study of abuse and neglect, nearly 3 million children, 1 out of every 25 children, experience some form of endangerment each year in the United States. And almost a third of these children experience direct physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. In any given year, more than 2 million children experience significant physical or emotional neglect. Recent findings have indicated that emotional neglect can be as detrimental to a child as physical or sexual abuse. By the time a child reaches the age of 18, the probability that he or she will have been directly affected by interpersonal or community violence is approximately 1 in 4. That's huge. That's 25% of the population. So it's not just a random person in a prison environment that is experiencing this. And many of us have adapted to it, for better or for worse. In any case, Zen has a lot to offer here that I think we should be aware of, if nothing else. And it doesn't mean you have to teach anybody these things, but just to know that our practice can be a powerful remedy for PTSD. I think it can, depending on how we practice. So 3 things I want to suggest that our practice facilitates for healing. And one is the movement practice. That our spiritual practice isn't just about sitting and meditating inside of a room by ourselves. It's actually about taking care of our life. It's about cleaning up after ourselves. I've mentioned this many times before, right? Cleaning the dishes, working in the garden, doing physical things. This is practice. Cooking, when we're moving our body and using it in some skillful way to help people out, to help the world out, to help our families out, in whatever way seems fit or appropriate. This is a powerful practice. Second is that we have ways of meditating that I think are well suited for somebody with trauma, because we're not just focusing on what's going on inside of us, right? Our meditation practice is focusing on the external environment as well. So for me, I try to be sensitive to that when I'm doing meditation instructions. I try to be sensitive to who I'm talking to, and providing the guidance that would be helpful for that particular person's situation. There are many ways. This is the thing, is that there's many aspects of meditation that we can teach, and the more we can become skillful in teaching them and aware of what might be helpful and what might not be helpful, the better. And so one of those things that may not be so helpful is a total internal focus in meditation, which is already what we don't do. We're not closing our eyes. We're not focusing completely on our physical sensations in our body, which can actually trigger a somebody with PTSD. But we're also focusing on the external world, on sound, on what we're seeing in the space around us. We're keeping our eyes open. But everybody's different. So I hesitate to say that there's one method that we have to aspire to or abide by in teaching meditation. But just to say that meditation can be a two-edged sword here. It can be very powerful. It can be a very powerful tool. It can also be not so helpful. And I've seen a case where my teacher just didn't know. There's this one man who came. He had PTSD from being in Iraq, and he just couldn't do the practice the way that she was suggesting it. But I think if it's done properly, it can be a helpful practice. And I think the third thing, and this is really key, is something that I try to impart, is that the practice has to be based in choice. You can't force somebody to do it. And this is, I think, where we get kind of caught up. Like, if it is contextualized in such a way where we give that person or people lots of exit spaces, right? Lots of opportunities to leave, then we're creating the internal environment for that person to relax, to rest, to feel like they're okay in the environment that they're in. So those three things, the practices of engaging with physical work, physical labor, the practice of meditation, depending on how it's offered, and then having everything based in choice. Those three things. If we can do those things, I think those are initial steps. This isn't going to solve any problem. It's just an attempt to educate a little bit about how Zen practice can be affirming for those who are in trauma recovery, and to encourage us to begin thinking about some of these issues. The universal dimension of reality exists inside the particular person. And if a person is suffering from trauma, that's something that we're all suffering with. And finding skillful ways to work with that, whether it's somebody in our Sangha or somebody in our family, this is an important practice. So I want to close with a short poem here. Eyes throughout the body. The body knows even when the mind forgets. The body is the gateway to the house of the Buddha. Virtue is never practiced alone. Conversing with Buddha happens every single moment. Thank you.
Thank you.